Hello everyone, I hope you all had a wonderful Christmas. I personally spent mine surrounded by family and being held hostage by my sister and father, forcing us to play extremely cringeworthy Christmas games that I begrudgingly enjoyed and overdosing on Mum's holiday baking. But now that Christmas is over, the magic is gone, I have awoken from my ginger molasses cookie-induced coma and am reminded that I am in fact in Canada, where the only certainty that exists is that the government will make every and any policy possible to screw over the Canadian people. And somehow, already in record time, we are seeing the complete collapse and failure of Trudeau's handgun ban policy. Imagine my shock. Despite banning handguns and thousands of other firearms across the board, we have had yet another shooting in this country where tragically an Ontario provincial police officer was killed. The officer was essentially ambushed while responding to an emergency call by two individuals, Randall McKenzie and Brandy Stewart-Sperry, who of course were both RPAL licensed gun owners, as those are the only Canadians eligible to obtain firearms. Oh, my bad. McKenzie actually had a lifetime firearms ban after being arrested December 1st last year, charged with a dozen offenses, including assault with a weapon, assault of a peace officer, assault in general, possession of a firearm without a license, carrying a concealed weapon, mischief, and possession of counterfeit money. And of course, the gun involved in his 2021 arrest was an illegally obtained handgun with its serial numbers removed. And while the media have not yet told us the type of firearm used in the shooting of this police officer earlier this week, I have a strong suspicion the type that might have been used and why they're not mentioning it. Perhaps it's because this is just another solidification of what legal gun owners have been saying in Canada for years now. Legal guns are not the problem. And it's worthwhile to look not only at the data on that, but the policies the government have in place currently that are not being adjusted or even looked at, which allowed this violent offender, now murderer, to be on the streets in the first place. But before we jump into this dire conversation, I wanted to give a huge thank you to this channel's sponsor, Noble Gold. $2,000. That's where gold is headed, according to predictions from the Bank of America. $2,000 an ounce with continued growth throughout 2023. And their predictions are looking fairly accurate, with gold crossing $1,800 at the beginning of December and the Fed failing to fight inflation. If this year has taught us anything, it's that tangible assets are the only assets you can count on, like gold. It is time to open a gold IRA. Crypto keeps on tanking, stocks are way too volatile, gold in your IRA is steady. Thousands of people have retired comfortably with the help of Noble Gold Investments. Now is the time to act. And if you get in before the end of this month, you'll receive an incredible free 3-ounce silver American Virtue coin with every qualified IRA of $20,000 or above. You can't go wrong with Noble Gold Investments. Call 877-646-5347 to find out more or visit noblegoldinvestments.com. Alright, so as mentioned, Randall McKenzie and what I assume to be his partner, Brandy Stewart-Sperry, murdered an Ontario police officer this Tuesday, December 27th. McKenzie was out on bail 6 months ago despite facing charges for assaulting a police officer and possessing an illegal handgun. Now you may be wondering how on earth this man was on bail. In a country that has become a world leader in gun control, wouldn't gun crimes be taken far more seriously, especially amongst a violent offender? Well, as mentioned in many of my previous videos, all actions by the Trudeau government point to the reality that their policies are not made to stop crime or shootings, but are simply political virtue signals that punish legal gun owners, the only people who actually follow the laws being made. In fact, while Trudeau's handgun ban received mass amounts of press last year, including praise from the mainstream media, less talked about was the Trudeau government's push to reduce sentencing requirements for serious gun crimes. Brought forward by the Liberals this year, Bill C-5 has already received royal assent and will soon become law, and is an amendment to the criminal code that repeals certain mandatory minimum sentencing penalties, including several serious gun crime penalties, among which include robbery and extortion with a firearm, gun smuggling, and selling of illegal guns, which normally would have a 3-year minimum sentence, but now will have no minimum sentence. The reason for this? Trudeau says the bill would address the overrepresentation of Black and Indigenous people in the criminal justice system, to which Toronto Sun columnist Brian Lilley accurately pointed out last year, if most of the people being charged with these crimes are Black and Indigenous, then so too are their victims. Do those Black or Indigenous victims deserve less justice? And even if their victims were not Black or Indigenous, did this police officer or people of any other race deserve to be victimized or killed by criminal shooters like Mackenzie simply because it seems racist to keep them behind bars and away from more potential victims? Along with the newly introduced Bill C-5, which aids violent offenders, our Canadian courts also decided back in 2020 that people's ethnic background, particularly if one is Indigenous, should be taken into account when reviewing their bail, with Mackenzie's parole board literally taking into consideration how he was victimized by colonialism. Well, our country constantly goes on, for good reason, about the many missing and murdered Indigenous women over the last few years. Many claim the reason for this is just racism. And I'm inclined to agree. But not racism in the traditional sense. Racism in the sense of bigotry of low expectations. I just finished and passed my hunting core course. And one of the many things you study in the course is the difference between regulations for Canadians versus Indigenous Canadians, one of which being to hunt. Indigenous Canadians don't even need to take the same course to get their requirements fulfilled, and they don't even need to be licensed in the first place, placing not only more firearm education, but more safety regulations in the hands of non-Indigenous Canadians. This applies for general gun licenses as well. Canadians must receive a Canadian firearms safety course in order to obtain a gun. There are age restrictions, police background and safety checks, criminal record reviews, history of violent behavior screenings. You even have to get a spouse or ex-spouse to sign your license application before you can purchase or obtain a firearm in this country. Yet, for Indigenous Canadians, you do not need to get safety training. They can be alternatively certified so long as you've received a recommendation from an Indigenous elder. They don't need background checks, and in fact, it's specifically outlined that if you're worried a criminal background or safety check may come up with red flags, don't worry about it. You can circumvent that by getting a recommendation from an elder. Despite this, the Trudeau government assumes it is racism sending more Indigenous people to Canada's jails for gun crime and not the obvious double standards in firearm ownership certification and requirements, which they say they put in place to reduce gun crime. And I'm inclined to agree, because statistically, those with RPALs, those who have been properly certified for gun ownership in this country, are simply not a problem. Observing data from 1997 to 2019, licensed firearm holders' homicide rates were 0.60 per 100,000 compared to the national homicide rate of 1.85 per 100,000. A licensed firearm owner in Canada is about 1/3 less likely to commit murder than the average Canadian. Now you may be thinking, what about homicide rates where specifically firearms are used? Well, firstly, to get an accurate assessment, you have to make the data match. You can't just compare PAL owners with every person in the country, because nearly 90% of PAL owners are men, and they legally must be adults. Both men and people over 18 have significantly higher homicide rates than women or youths. So you're going to get inflated rates in general if you're just looking at PAL owners versus the general populace. Whereas if you adjust and look at more comparable data, such as PAL owners versus males over the age of 18 who have killed with a firearm, adult men have a rate of 1.33 per 100,000, whereas PAL owners only have a rate of 0.67 per 100,000. This is all data that was presented to the Canadian Senate by SFU professor and criminologist Gary Mauser, whose research I have linked below and would highly recommend observing, although clearly and very unfortunately the Canadian government didn't. The data shows clearly that access to firearms, legal access that is, does not result in more murders, but the Liberals' proposed regulations have only reduced access to firearms for this one group that are clearly not the problem. The expected impacts on shootings should obviously be zero. Part of the reason is that we are actually pretty good in Canada at denying legal access to people who shouldn't have guns. For example, gang, organized crime members, they can't have guns here. Yet gang killings still involve a firearm 76% of the time, and gangs and organized crime account for 20% of all killings. which is probably why even the Liberals are spending over $300 million on fighting illegal gun trafficking. That's a pretty solid admission that they know what the real problem is, even if they plan on letting the offenders out on bail the next day. Meanwhile, Bill C-21 and other bills like it are obviously just for show. And if gang shootings go down as a result of their spending on preventing illegal trafficking, well, they'll just let the public think it was because they took hunting rifles out of locked safes. In truth, not a single gun ban law proposed by the current Liberal government would have prevented this police shooting. In fact, the only legislation brought forward that it seems would have impacted a shooting like this is the Liberals' implementation of Bill C-5, which will put more violent offenders on the streets like Mackenzie. So much for that $300 million in spending, am I right? And sadly, this is not the only shooting this year that has disproved the Liberal Party's approach to guns, as just earlier this month, 5 people were horrifically killed in Toronto by a 73-year-old man who was once again using an illegally obtained handgun to commit this massacre after the gun transfer freeze and purchase ban went through. While the Liberal government constantly appealed to mass shootings to ban guns for our safety, it seems that not once have they cared enough about our safety to do more than 10 minutes of research into what is actually causing the shootings. And I have no doubt we will continue to see this trend throughout 2023 of Liberal narratives being debunked by the deaths of more Canadians. The unfortunate thing for these victims, of course, being the only way to prevent these crimes from happening more is for the Liberals to admit their assessment of crime causation may be wrong and to change their approach. But I fear sticking to the script may be more important to our politicians than actually solving the crises they feign to care about. But you know what? For once, I'm not going to end a video on a black pill. Doctor-prescribed white pills here, straight line of hopium into the veins. As every day these horrific things happen, it is getting harder to hide the reality of gun crime in this country. While every ban goes through and the crime continues to persist, you can't deny it, what's really going on here. Even the last bill I discussed, Bill C-21, is raising questions amongst our most left-wing party in Canada, the NDP, who are saying, wait, hunting rifles? We not only told our constituents we weren't going to ban those, but they are not contributing to the problems you say you're trying to address at all. So, while I would not stake my mental health on this prediction, I do believe we have a smidge, a slight chance of an opportunity for sanity to prevail in this country and for some of these bills to not go through, or at the very least in the future, be rescinded. Because people are starting to ask questions, and the government don't seem to have the answers, but reality certainly does. I appreciate you all, and I will see you next time.